Hi everyone, Mr. P here with lesson 21 on the Black Power movement and its influence on other militant left movements during the late 1960s, early 1970s. So first I want to mention briefly and remind you how Black Power sort of emerged out of the civil rights movement. So you might remember SNCC and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee formed after the sit-ins, advised by Ella Baker. That's in 1960. And then the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had formed prior to that, 1957, after the Montgomery bus boycott, and was mostly formed by Black clergy. And so those two organizations were two of the kind of leading organizations, national organizations in the civil rights movement. And they began to develop disagreements, not just between them, but within those organizations as well, especially within SNCC. And so, you know, we have on the one hand, and used by both organizations, using nonviolent direct action to fight for liberation. And then there was also discussed at the time and used by various individuals and folks, armed self-defense. And that was something that, you know, Malcolm X was pushing for. And after Freedom Summer and the violence faced in Freedom Summer, SNCC began to have internal disagreements about whether to commit fully to nonviolent direct action or commit to armed self-defense, something that they were beginning to kind of question. Ella Baker advised that they hold all possibilities, right? Any means necessary, and they don't commit to one single ideological stance regarding the means towards liberation. But they also had disagreements about the aim. And so most of the early work that SCLC did was towards desegregation and integration. And those within SNCC who were, you know, beginning to talk about Black Power were thinking that, you know, it was not about fighting for integration into a racist, white-dominated society, but about desegregating. Sure, let's desegregate, and then people have the choice to integrate. That's basically right, taking away legal segregation. But let's fight for more than that. Let's fight for economic, social, political power within our own communities and in our own right. And so within SNCC began to develop a separatist, nationalist kind of aim or understanding framework to understand liberation. And so at the March Against Fear, James Meredith, who had integrated University of Mississippi, took a march from, I believe, Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. And it was to raise awareness around, you know, enfranchisement issues and continued racism in the South. And at that march, Dr. King and SCLC and SNCC were both present. Stokely Carmichael later changed his name to Kwame Ture, featured here. And let me kind of go ahead and present at this point. And so, oh, there we go. So Stokely Carmichael at speech at the end of that march said, right, we have been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. But we got to start saying now is Black Power. We want Black Power. And it becomes quite a famous speech. Stokely Carmichael is credited with first using it as a public political statement. Of course, it had been talked about prior to that. And so SNCC begins moving under the leadership of Stokely Carmichael, who ends up winning leadership over John Lewis, who kind of bridged both worlds. Stokely Carmichael ends up moving SNCC in a more Black Power direction. That same year, later that same year, the Black Panther Party formed in Oakland, California, really, you know, out of in response to the police brutality that Black communities were facing. They also, and we'll talk about Black Panther Party later in a later lesson in more depth, you know, but they begin to develop a socialist stance and a mutual aid kind of programs, breakfast, free health clinics, free breakfast for children, those types of programs. And so, again, we'll talk more about the Black Panther Party later. But so there's multiple organizations that take this Black Power stance. And that combined with the influence of socialism and independence movements in Asia and Africa, there's multiple groups within different racial communities that form. And so the first I want to talk about is the Brown Berets. Here's an image of women in the Brown Berets. So you can tell they took a very similar to the Black Panther Party aesthetic, having, instead of kind of black berets, it's brown, having a very uniform like stance. They would show up at actions, marching, that sort of thing. That was the aesthetic. The Brown Berets started as a different organization called the Young Chicanos in Action organization, founded by a man named Dr. Sanchez. And their first protest was against police killings of Latino men in Los Angeles. They also end up setting up other kinds of programs inspired by the Black Panthers. They set up the Barrio Free Clinic, providing a lot of family planning and health services for community members in East LA, a heavily Chicano neighborhood. They also set up a campaign called the Chicano Moratorium Campaign, where they are calling to end the kind of disproportionate dying of Chicano soldiers in Vietnam War. Chicano soldiers in the late 60s accounted for around 20% of the deaths in the Vietnam War of U.S. soldiers. And yet Mexican Americans, Chicanos, only made up around 10% of the U.S. population. And so they were disproportionately fighting on the front lines of the war that had nothing really to do with them. And so a war that actually began with the U.S. upholding France's colonial claims to Vietnam. And so they took an anti-Vietnam War stance. So the Brown Berets, heavily influenced by the Black Panther Party and influencing each other. The Young Lords set up mostly by Puerto Ricans, but also had other folks in the group. About a quarter of the group was Black. Many of them were, Afro-Latino. And Cha-Cha Jimenez is one of the kind of often cited leaders of this group, although there were many. Some of their important campaigns in the late 60s. One was known as the Garbage Offensive. They ran a campaign that got the New York City municipal division to clean the streets in Spanish Harlem. They also, you can see their, one of their kind of street art pieces here. And they also, they had a very feminine and kind of queer rights stance as well. Sylvia Rivera, a trans Latino woman, worked in collaboration with them. They, took a stance against the kind of machismo that was, sexist and homophobic. They also pushed for a patient bill of rights by occupying Lincoln Hospital. They got, lead poisoning testing done for children, and that led to, a ban on kind of lead. They also implemented free breakfast at a church that they pressured a church to begin to implement. So, they were doing a lot of things that were meant to be very much geared towards making sure that the communities that they lived in were best served. So that's the Young Lords. Also talk about the Asian American Political Alliance. And again, all of these titles here will lead you to links where you can read more about these organizations and campaigns. The Asian American Political Alliance formed at Berkeley, mostly college-educated folks, formed to support, Asian farm workers. They also became part of the Third World Liberation Front. I'll talk about in the next slide, where they pushed for ethnic studies. So the Asian American Political Alliance. There was also the Red Guard, which was a militant Asian group in San Francisco's Chinatown. They successfully prevented a TB testing center from getting closed. They pushed for a breakfast program. They were a smaller organization, about 200 members at their height, before FBI infiltration ended up reducing their membership to just a couple dozen. There were other less middle-class Asian groups, so like the Yellow Brotherhood mostly takes in ex-cons, gang members, and ex-servicemen, and becomes a group in Los Angeles that becomes a little bit more militant and much more alienated from the larger Asian American community. But all these groups, the Red Guard, AAPA and the Yellow Brotherhood all took an active stance to resist the popular image of Asian Americans as kind of apologetic and compliant with larger systems. And so, there were even folks who joined the Black Panther Party, as well. Finally, the American Indian movement formed in the late 60s and ran through the 70s, and still continues some work. They formed to kind of push the U.S. to uphold and renew treaties that had been broken, and so all of these groups take a kind of radical militant stance, a very socialist stance, but they implement a lot of mutual aid programs, and I think that's really important for us to take note of. Mutual aid meaning gathering, pooling resources to support the neediest members in society. So those free breakfast programs and free health clinics. Actually, these free breakfast programs implemented by the Black Panther Party, by the Young Lords, by the Red Guard, end up influencing the federal government to begin the free breakfast program in all schools around the country. Something they took actually from the very radical left that they ended up infiltrating and preventing from growing. So what all of these groups at the college level, those groups that were relevant at the college level end up working together to form the Third World Liberation Front, which becomes a coalition of different ethnic student groups. So, Black studies, American Indian studies, Asian American studies, Chicano studies. These different groups were pushing for these different ethnic studies programs at San Francisco State University, UC Berkeley, and they staged student strikes to demand these programs, more professors of color, and a third world college. They do get more professors of color and ethnic studies spreads around the country. This Third World Liberation Front really provides a strong example of the ways in which there's interracial solidarity and work across these ethnic differences to come together in solidarity with one another. These student strikes led to some violent backlash from police. And of course, some students fought back against those police. And so you end up with police using forms of tear gas and whatnot on these college campuses, right? So for months at a time, these college campuses were incredibly militarized because of the police presence, because of the resistance to meet these demands for an ethnic studies curriculum. So the last thing I'll say in this video is what an ethnic studies curriculum actually is, and think about, you can think about our approach to African American studies at Central High School, but here's definitions from the Seattle Public Schools Ethnic Studies program. So ethnic studies critically examines systems of power and oppression created by white supremacy. They challenge the so-called master narrative, this narrative that focuses in its language, choice content on white Eurocentric versions of history. So the master narrative is not just what is taught, but how and what it calls what it teaches. So for example, think of, your world history text and those chapters titled The Age of Exploration or Westward Expansion in the US History. Well, these are cloaking terms, right? Age of Exploration involved settler colonialism and the genocide of hundreds of thousands, millions of indigenous people. Westward expansion was, designed both to take land from indigenous groups, give it to, white members of society, and also for many in the U.S. designed to spread slavery, chattel slavery. And so these terms that we call these period of histories, they cloak and hide is actually happening. And so ethnic studies tries to go behind the master narrative and bring forth the stories of those less told. Think of the danger of a single story. It centers these stories of resistance of communities of color and tribal sovereignties. And it's that shift to looking at resistance and liberation specifically, empowering students to learn from their ancestors, from those who came before us, to continue to resist. So it does have an approach and a goal, right? Which is not just to study, but to inspire, racial pride and continued resistance against oppression and for liberation. So next video, we'll talk about the Chicano student movement and do a deeper dive into one example of this.